Right, the war on Ukraine is, of course, devastating. Russia blames the West for imposing its sphere of influence. Russia also fears NATO's forces. But what if this war wasn't just about the influence? What if it was really about energy? Can Europe and the rest of the world survive without Russian gas? Joining me now to shed some light on the current energy crisis is Chief Energy Economist Paulius Kuncinas. He's based in Brussels. I'm very happy that he's able to join us today. Paulius, thanks so much for joining me here on Anews. A pleasure to see you, sir. Now, I just want to get straight into this. We know that new sanctions have been laid out so that Russia can't sell its gas to Europe and the USA, but what is Plan B? I mean, what can Europe do to get away from Russian gas?
I would first say that Europe is very reluctant to completely stop all imports of Russian gas. I think that option is absolutely last resort, and I don't see any appetite for it, especially in Germany. That's the first thing. The second thing, there is a plan indeed already being developed. It's on the table to reduce gas imports from Russia by at least 2/3. So traditionally, Europe imports around 150 BCM, and Europe wants to reduce it by 100 by the end of the year. I think that plan is extremely ambitious, and if we look at the details, at least half of that effort should come from replacing Russian gas with liquefied natural gas diversification via LNG. At least 17 BCM comes from renewables. There's energy efficiency, all of these well-known sources of replacement, but it's quite difficult to achieve it in a short term. So in reality, I don't think Europe can wean itself off gas. I think what in reality will happen is that because of high prices, the demand will drop. And I guess the good news is that the winter is coming to an end. So there is time a little bit to mobilize these efforts and to try and fill up the storage in time for the next winter.
It's interesting you talk about storage. We'll get to the storage in a second. Now, if we don't get, or if Europe doesn't get its gas from Russia, or if it tries to wean it off, as you say, 2/3 by the end of the year, who will it get the gas from? Are there alternatives? And I'm sure that's going to make it more expensive, right?
Absolutely agree on prices. I don't think we're going to see any big reduction in energy prices. That's the new reality that Europe is learning to live with. Fortunately, there's a lot of money, funds being mobilized. As we speak, the Versailles meeting of EU Council is starting. And I think as much as 200 to 300 billion euros will be raised in order to help households and businesses to deal with high prices. So that problem will be addressed. As far as supply is concerned, yes, Europe and US is trying to find alternatives. We know the usual suspects. It's obviously Qatar, Norway. US in its own right is a very significant supplier. Here you have to activate shale oil and shale gas producers, which is proving to be a difficult process. There is a big question on China. If China demand, for instance, is lower than expected, if China switches to coal, they could free up a bit of LNG from Asia. So it's still an open-ended question. The answer is we don't know yet, but Europe and US is intensifying the efforts to find an alternative.
Okay, I mean, COP26 seems like a joke now after all this that's going on recently. Aren't Europe keen to go fast forward into green energy? Is that not an option?
It's really a paradox, because what happened 2 days after the war of that weekend, Germany's famous U-turn, when they essentially said, given its war, we are open to reopening the nuclear and even the dirtiest of production of lignite coal. But at the same time, they said this has to be temporary, and in exchange, we want to accelerate the green transition. So essentially, it is odd that on the one hand you are revisiting coal, which was supposed to be phased out as quickly as possible, but at the same time you're putting enormous effort on wind and solar. So you are having basically two tracks moving at the same time. The objective being to reduce dependence on Russia. So in a way, you will end up with more solar, more alternatives, but you will have to accept that coal and nuclear will be around for longer.
That is sad to hear, Paulius, indeed. What kind of motivation does the US have to sell gas to Europe? I mean, is this a political move by Biden to finally get back on the table? I know you're more of an economist, less than the politics, but could this be a move by the US to try and get to sell its own gas to Europe?
Well, absolutely. I mean, US does have a very lively, as you know, dynamic oil and gas sector. It's one of the biggest producers of shale gas. It had ambitions to liquefy shale gas and export it and compete with other producers. So it is an opportunity. I think the motivation, we have to be a little bit, shall we say, idealistic here. The motivation is to help Europe to deal with this pressure, because as you know, Europe is very reluctant, is rather afraid of cutting off gas supplies. And there is, by the way, a real risk that Russia could unilaterally stop exports of gas. If situation escalates, as I think it will, there is a threat that Russia will take this very radical decision and will cut exports of Russian gas to Europe in order to put it under pressure. And then there will be no choice but to deal with it. So I think U.S. primary motivation is to basically help Europe from security point of view, to ensure that there is no huge increase in prices and that politicians have the determination to follow through their basically position vis-a-vis Russia.
Okay, now just to clarify here, the Nord Stream 1 pipeline is flowing, right, from Russia to Europe. That hasn't been stopped, hasn't slowed down at all. The Nord Stream 2, Germany vetoed it, said that's not going to be opened. So gas is flowing to Europe. Now, if Russia does cut that Nord Stream 1 pipeline, what does Europe do? Can they get gas from Azerbaijan? Is there a flow through Turkey? Is that an option? Is it just shipping LNG from Qatar or from the US for immediate, yeah.
I would argue that on the gas front, they're already doing everything that's possible. I think what happens if Nord Stream 1, I should say, is shut, is that the prices spike and just Europe becomes a more attractive market. So it attracts more LNG from other destinations. But in reality, I mean, you will be burning through your storage. So the storage volumes will go down. And I think in reality, what will happen is that Europe will have to quickly ramp up nuclear and coal and probably reduce consumption. We can't rule out a scenario where we revisit the kind of environment we had during COVID, where people are told to stay at home, where factories need to basically take a holiday in order to just reduce consumption. And let's not forget, we are coming out of a winter season. The weather here in Brussels today was a warm day of nearly 20 degrees. So soon I think the households will be asked to conserve energy. I think that's what the war effort may come down to. It's through demand destruction that you basically clear this. I don't see any kind of silver bullets in terms of new supply.
Well, it might be 20 degrees there, Paulius. It's snowing here in Istanbul, so we're still cold. All right. So there's no release, quick solving, and quick way solution to this problem for Europe. But how about let's talk about a little bit about green energy. Let's talk about fracking. The UK just today were in the newspapers, hitting it quite large. Fracking. What is fracking? Tell us a little bit about fracking.
Well, it's that old technology that was basically, I think, invented in the US. and it involves basically injecting a lot of chemicals into the ground and releasing oil and gas that's trapped in the geological formations. It's a very exciting technology, and when it first came out, it would obviously offered, especially the United States, a lot of new supply, and it became popular in the US, in Canada, until people discovered that injecting chemicals into the ground also runs the risk of contaminating groundwater. So that's why it never really expanded outside the US. There were experiments, including in Ukraine, by the way. Ukraine really tried hard to adopt this technology. Chevron was active in Donbas region, but eventually had to abandon due to environmental protests. Some cynics say that the Gazprom was funding these environmental groups. But the crux of the matter is it's quite a unpopular way of producing new gas. The reason why it works in the US because it has basically the areas where it's being produced in Texas, in North Dakota, are basically deserts. There are no people there, there are mountains. Whereas in the UK, the reason there's been such a resistance is that it's densely populated, and there is a lot of legitimate concerns that this could cause environmental damage. So I'm not that bullish on the revival of fracking in the UK. And I must add that it never really took off. There is no real industry in fracking in the UK the way that there is in the US. It was at an experimental stage. It was supposed to be closed down, filled with cement by the mid this year. And quite frankly, I don't think that's the solution, even to the UK, which is much more open to this idea.
Well, let's hope so. Last question, sir. Paulius, I really appreciate you joining us here on Anews. Honestly, it's good to have someone of your caliber on the show. But how far ahead are we with green energy? I mean, I was reading a report the other day that green energy is all well and good, but we still haven't got there with the technology when it comes to storing green energy. Is that safe to say?
We're on the cusp of solving the storage problem. It's more the cost rather than the technology. Storage really comes from two sources. One is battery, and the other one is hydrogen. I think hydrogen is probably 3 to 5 years out. I think battery, we are witnessing a battery revolution. And it's not just for utility scale, solar and wind, but it's also primarily for electric mobility, which is experiencing very fast take-up in Europe. So I think I'm actually quite excited for green transition. I don't think it's slowing down. I think it's accelerating. There's funds committed. Europe committed 750 billion. That's being deployed this year. So, I wouldn't be writing this off, the fact that we are experiencing this crisis, I think actually helping green transition as opposed to slowing it down.
I hope so, Paulius, because by the sounds of it, you're talking about coal coming back into our lives. Let's hope that's not the case.
It's a temporary solution.
Let's hope so. Let's hope. Paulius Kuncinas, thank you so much for joining me here on Anews. A pleasure to see you, sir. Thank you very much.